Now, something as I was looking at the test, I think I neglected to discuss this with you, and I wanted to make sure we touched on it. It seems like it was the next point I was going to give in a lecture, and I ran out of time, and I never quite got back to it. And it has to do with the connection between Hegel and the so-called documentary hypothesis. Did we ever get to that? Okay. Let's just think about that for a moment. So this is partly in the spirit of review and partly in the spirit of new information. So, you know, a little bit of a hybrid here. But there is, in the 19th century, a development in biblical studies called the documentary hypothesis. Ever heard of it? Anybody ever heard of the documentary hypothesis? Is this a brand new term? It may be. I just didn't know if it had popped up at any point. All right, the documentary hypothesis proceeds on the assumption that the Bible was produced in a purely naturalistic way. This would be straight out of Hegel's assumptions. So, I'm reading the Bible and I hear discussions of miracles, and I know, of course, that miracles cannot happen. I mean, what intelligent person would ever take seriously some idea that Jesus walked on the water, for Pete's sake? I mean, you know, you've got to be a Neanderthal to believe something as silly as that, right, Stephen? And so, you know. So I'm a sophisticated, up-to-date 19th century scholar, and I read in the Bible some account of Moses standing at the side of the Red Sea and slapping the water. I know that this is a later embellishment. I just know that. I mean, who wouldn't know something like that? But the question then still comes up, how did that account come to be written? What are the natural historical explanations that account for a story of a miracle, or what they called a miracle tale? How did that happen to find its way into the biblical text? You see the problem? I see an account of a miracle. I know it cannot have happened as reported. So how did it come to be reported given my naturalistic assumptions? All right. Well, that's where biblical scholarship went in the 19th century. That's why Hegel is considered one of the great contributors to liberalism. Now, I've already talked about liberalism with you, haven't I? You've got that. Well, what I'm doing is a footnote to liberalism called kind of the modification of biblical scholarship in the documentary hypothesis. That's where we're going, yeah.
So did Hegel come up with this idea?
No, he did not. This is later people implementing a Hegelian approach to biblical scholarship. Okay, so this is not Hegel, to my knowledge. It wouldn't surprise me if he said something like this, but the name normally associated with the documentary hypothesis and the application of liberal assumptions to biblical studies, the name associated with that is a guy named Wellhausen. And so whenever you come across the name Wellhausen, V-E-L-L-H-A-U-S-E-N, that's the association you want to make. And so the notion was these documents were produced based on some kind of combination of various sources over time, and usually there was an evolutionary assumption that was applied as well. So the assumption was that if we go back to very ancient Israelite life, we're going to find these people were as pagan, as polytheistic as anybody else. But in an evolutionary way, they gradually moved from their paganism to a kind of monotheistic approach, you know. And so then we say, okay, do we find evidence of that in the biblical record? And the most famous approach, the one that Wellhausen came up with, and it's still around to this day, this has not died, surprisingly enough, is the so-called JEPD hypothesis. Does that ring a bell? Okay, you've heard of this. I would expect you, well, Spencer just said yes.
That just reminds, I don't know, it just kind of directed me.
All right, well, Spencer, you nodded your head yes.
I have no idea.
I take it back. I've never heard of it.
JEPD, I don't know. Maybe I'm just remembering my alphabet, but
Yeah.
it sounds familiar.
All right, well, it very well might. Anybody? Sydney, you ever come up with it? Stephen? No? Okay, well, you shouldn't have made it to your senior year and not have encountered this at some point, so I'm glad I'm tucking it in here. I'm glad we got this in. All right, so here's the idea. We read the Old Testament, you know. I mean, I hope all of you read the Old Testament routinely as part of your kind of Christian disciplines and devotional study and so on. So you're reading the Old Testament. And what you are, if you're thoughtful, realizing is that, first of all, one person couldn't have written all of this. That it must represent a variety of contributors from various times, sources, and ways of thinking. And so this is the documentary hypothesis, that the Bible is an assembly of various documents that came from different times, different authors, different places, and were later redacted, edited, combined to produce one sort of, you know, narrative as an end product, usually much later in time. And the famous notion was that there were basically 4 separate documentary sources originally. Okay. The first one was the Yahwist. So the J is for the Yahwist. You know that Y and J are basically the same letter in Hebrew. So that's the Yahwist source. Then you've got the Elohim source. Then you've got the so-called priestly source. And then you have the Deuteronomic source. Now this has been around since the mid-1800s, but if you go off to seminary someday, I absolutely guarantee that you're going to come across this as continuing as a working hypothesis of how to deal with Old Testament scripture. Now if you go to a conservative seminary, you're going to deal with it in a critical way. You know, in other words, there's going to be showing why it doesn't really hold water. If you go to a more liberal seminary, then it's just going to be assumed. This is the way it is. You know, so it kind of depends on where you go to school. But that you will be exposed to this, I think, is a given. So here's the notion. We've got a variety of sources spread out over time, and each of these represents a particular perspective on the religious life of the people of God. The Elohim source typically would be regarded as the earliest. And by the way, the basic meaning of the word Elohim, if you just translate it straight up into English, would be what? What word would best translate the Hebrew word Elohim? It would be the English word. Anybody know? Anybody? No? Who'd you guys take doctrine from? Was it me?
Half you have Mr. Nixon, but you tell us the Elohim.
Okay. So I'm the guy that's on the hook here, right? All right. Basic meaning is the word gods. Remember that?
Yes.
El is God. You see now, resentfully acknowledge. Oh yeah, it doesn't affect. El means God, singular. Elohim, that's just the plural in Hebrew, and it adds an S in English. So God becomes. So that's basically, simply, the plural word for God. And the Elohim theory is, see, that proves that very, very early the Jewish people were polytheistic because they called their God gods. And the gods said, let's do this. And gods said, let's do that, you know. And so it's like a pantheon of gods. They're all counseling together to do things. And so that's what's going on. So that's a very early period. You've got another source that comes much later, which is concerned with the religious life. And they bring in mostly the whole sacrificial programs, you know, the kind of the cult that's connected to the temple and so on. The Deuteronomic source is usually regarded as the latest. And the theory is that the book found by Josiah, remember in the temple, remember that story? Was not found in the temple, it was written at the time. And then the theory was it was found, you see. It's like going into the gym and digging around in some stuff, maybe in a closet in there, and finding a book that was written by somebody that lived 100 years ago, and actually you wrote the book yourself, and then you just pretended it was found by somebody 100 years ago. That's the idea. So the Deuteronomic source, which claims to be written by Moses, was actually produced in the post-exilic period, that is much later in Israel's history after they were exiled and so on. The Yahweh source represents kind of the beginnings of the monotheistic outlook. And all of these are, in a very complicated way, seen to be woven together. And they produce the Old Testament as we know it. And so it becomes quite a science. I've got a whole set of commentaries at home that takes this approach. And so every time you read an analysis of the Old Testament text, they just routinely say, now the Elohim source is saying this, but of course the Yahweh source contributed that, and they just talk that way as if it's absolutely, it's just given, it's proven, it's accepted. It's sort of like accepting the theory of evolution. It's just given. You don't dispute it. It's just there. So anyway, all of that really came as a result of Hegel and Hegel's influence in Christian scholarship generally, and particularly in biblical studies, and it gave rise to the so-called documentary hypothesis. In the New Testament, the most famous example of this would be the so-called synoptic problem. Ever heard of that? The synoptic problem? Nope.
I'm just learning all sorts of things.
Okay, well that's fine. That's okay. I'm glad to be the guy that's bringing this to your attention. All right. So in the New Testament, we have the so-called synoptic problem. What are the synoptic gospels? What are they? Name the. What are the synoptic gospels?
Yes, the synoptic gospels include
Genesis. These are gospels, man.
Oh, good call.
The Gospel of Genesis.
Yeah, that's right. The ones that syntopically address the life of Christ, which would be
that's good.
Matthew.
Thank you.
Mark.
Great.
Luke.
Okay, you better stop right there. That's it.
I'll stop right there.
Good. Excellent. All right.
Why is John not in there?
John is not one of the synoptic gospels, right? They are called synoptic. That's why. I know that's not really much of an answer, but work with me here. It just isn't, And so anyway, the reason is because Matthew, Mark, and Luke have a striking, kind of similarity of material. In other words, you read Matthew, you read Mark, you read Luke, you realize that a lot of the stories are virtually identical. The layout is very similar, and so synoptic means seen through the same lens. They all sort of see it the same way with minor variations. John, on the other hand, is quite different. There's a whole lot of material in John that you don't find in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. So John is considered, not synoptic for that reason. And I think you all have a sense of that. If you read the good Gospel of John, it starts off, in the beginning was the Word. Well, there's nothing like that in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. John does not include a narrative of the birth of Christ. First thing off, you're dealing with John the Baptist. Lengthy discussions of almost a philosophical character. The whole bread of life discourse in John chapter 6, not found in the others. On and on it goes. I mean, John is really, marches to his own drummer. And so, but these three guys have a lot in common. So the question is, how come these three, in some cases, reproduce each other? You find stories in Mark that are reproduced virtually verbatim in Matthew. Now somebody might say, well, they were both there and saw it. And that's a hypothetical possibility. But even at that, it would be unexpected if Spencer and I go to the same football game, and watch the same game and come home and write a short account of it, it would be virtually impossible to imagine that he and I would write verbatim, the same account of the event. He's got his style, I've got mine, we have different perspectives, different things we're interested in. You would expect we could describe truthfully the same game and yet be a quite different account, right? So why is it that when Mark and Matthew and Luke describe certain events, they do it almost verbatim with only minor variations, the same words and so on? That's the synoptic problem. The theory is that usually the way it goes is that Mark was the first written. The early church said it was Matthew, that's why they put Matthew first, but this approach assumes Mark is first. Then the assumption is that both Matthew and Luke had Mark in front of them. But both of them wanted to modify Mark according to their own particular agenda, their own perspective. And so Matthew includes material that would be what you call Mark's material, but Matthew also includes stuff that is distinctively Matthew. All right? So Matthew has Matthew, and Matthew has Mark. Over here you've got Matthew or Luke using some of Mark, but Luke also using unique material to Luke. So we find stuff in Luke that you don't find in Mark or Matthew. We find stuff in Matthew that we don't find in Mark or Luke. You follow me? Then we also find stuff in Luke and Matthew that is not present in Mark. Follow me? And that is commonly called the blank source. I don't know if you've ever covered this before. Okay. It's called the Q source, from the German word Quelle, which means source. And so what you've got is Q, which represents an independent source that came to Matthew and came to Luke, but not to Mark. You've got Mark, and then you've got material that is distinctively Matthew's, distinctively Luke's. And then all kinds of games are played as to how we understand those various sources and what was Matthew's concern when he brings to the text stuff that is distinctively his own contribution. Why does he do that? What's his agenda? What's he trying to accomplish? And so on. And it becomes quite a sophisticated science. And I have to say, in principle, I don't object to the idea that Matthew may have had a copy of Mark in front of him, or Luke may have had a copy of Mark in front of him. It's not like this is heresy to say this. I'm just saying that sometimes they get a lot of mileage out of it, more than one might expect. Yeah.
So Wellhausen was the JEPD guy. Was he also
He was
synoptic problem?
he also did kind of got people thinking along these lines as well. Yeah.
Okay.
This is all part of documentary hypothesis.
Okay.
Yeah. Right. You don't see quite so much the evolutionary piece here, because everybody grants this all happened in the first century, or first and second century. Here, this kind of Old Testament, this would span many hundreds of years, and so you could allow for more of a kind of evolutionary religious development. All right. So anyway, go ahead, Stephen.
You mentioned that people who investigate the synoptic problem, that they try to figure out what Matthew and Luke's agenda was when they wrote their books.
Right.
Do people typically just think that they wanted to supplement what Mark had already stated, or do they think that?
No, usually it's there's more of an axe to grind. Matthew is commonly understood as writing in a fashion that is highly critical of the Jewish world. And he wants to argue that Christ is king, and he wants to do it in a sort of, he wants to do it in an argumentative way. And he has there's things you find in Matthew that are pretty powerful. Probably the most powerful is where the trial of Jesus, the Jewish people say to Pilate, "His blood be on us and on our children." Wow. There's been a whole lot done with that verse that's given rise to a lot of anti-Semitism in history. His blood be on us and on our children, Did they really say that? Well, probably so. It's in the Bible, but this approach would say, no, probably not. That's Matthew trying to advance his agenda, which is pretty hostile to the Jewish people, right? Luke, on the other hand, clearly doesn't have that concern at all. He's writing in a way that wants to engage the Roman mind. So Matthew has way more quotes from the Old Testament than Luke, because Luke doesn't care as much about the Old Testament, because if you're arguing with a Roman, what's the Old Testament to them? And so he sort of presents Jesus more as the citizen of the world, Whereas Matthew presents Jesus as the king of the Jews. And you see that. I think it's plain enough. If you read them and kind of think about it, you'll see that distinction. The documentary hypothesis goes a little further than that. It really makes that the driving engine behind all of these reports, and usually has some kind of naturalistic assumptions to bring to it as well. So I think there's something to it, but my personal opinion is sometimes they get a little more mileage out of this than is warranted. Does that make sense? Is that a response? Sydney, you got it.
And so did Hegel's influence create, because you said Hegel was a big influence on liberalism, is that because of the evolutionary thought?
Yeah. Remember, I think I gave you this, didn't I, not too long ago, the 4 features of liberalism. Remember those? So what were they? Do you recall any of them? They were humanism, immanentism,
and optimism, and then pantheism?
And
Naturalism.
Naturalism. Okay, so there you go. That's my little summary of bullets of liberalism. All of those come straight out of Hegel. Hegel is the ultimate humanist. God becomes virtually indistinguishable from us. God is immanent. He is here, he is not out there. He's an optimist. Things are progressing constantly. He's a naturalist. He doesn't allow for supernatural intervention in history. So you'd say Hegel sort of defines liberalism. What happened was that the Christian world said, hey, that Hegel's pretty cool. Let's import a Hegelian outlook wholesale and use it as a new way to think about the Christian faith. And so liberalism is a hybrid of Hegel, on the one hand, and Christianity on the other. In my opinion, liberalism sells the soul of Christianity to be fashionable in a Hegelian world. You follow me? Today we tend to sell the soul of Christianity to be fashionable in different ways. But there's always a temptation that the Christian people have to want to be fashionable in the contemporary culture. And it always tends to make us want to gut the heart of the Christian faith. Because, to be honest with you, the preaching of the cross is to those who are perishing foolishness. And when we start getting cozy with the worldly outlook, we always want to negotiate the cross out of the picture and import, Hegel or whatever, Bertrand Russell or whoever, whatever the prevailing kind of appealing outlook might be. Go ahead.
So just to get it clear in my mind, Hegel defined and established liberalism, and from that idea, documentary hypothesis came about as a topic.
Documentary hypothesis is the application of liberal assumptions to biblical study. That's what it is. The application of liberal assumptions to biblical scholarship. Please, Megan.
So is the JEPD, is the purpose of that trying to just eliminate miracles or explain why miracles don't exist?
It's that, but more than that. It is simply an attempt to account for the Bible in the form that we have it. You have a Bible, and you flip it open, you've got Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, the first 5 books. The documentary hypothesis starts on the working assumption that one man could not have written all that. That this is not the product of one man's labors. How do we know? He asked the guy. Well, because you've got too many writing styles in there. You've got little snippets, which obviously represent one writing style. Then over here you got a different snippet, a different pericope, they would call them, that represents a completely different writing style. Different vocabularies, different perspectives, and they're all mashed together. They're all kind of woven together by some final editor, and they just take that for granted. I've got a friend, pretty good friend, who's a PhD in biblical studies at a university in this area, and all I'll say is it's not Whitworth. And he just assumes this, and he thinks I'm an idiot for not seeing it. You know, I mean, we've had this conversation, and he thinks this is just given. You know, I go, what's the matter with you? Well, don't you see this? And I said, well, actually, I don't quite see it as clearly as you do. You know, I mean, I kind of see what you're saying there. You know, but I'm not pushed right over the edge by this. I just am not quite sure that is as compelling as you seem to think it is. But in the world of kind of biblical scholarship generally out there, this is just taken for granted. Something like this. Ever heard of the Jesus Seminar? You ever heard of that? Well, that's a good example of the application of a documentary hypothesis to the New Testament. The Jesus Seminar, you know, they get together every, whatever, year or 4 years or whatever it is, and they take a text of Scripture. Let's say they take what? I don't know if they've ever done this, but let's say it's blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of God or heaven. So they take that statement, and they do all kinds of great scholarship to figure out, did Jesus actually say that? And they vote. This is like, whatever, 20 scholars. And they vote by throwing a marble into a hat. I'm serious. These are high-powered scholars. There's a white marble, a black marble, and a gray marble. And they throw the marble into the hat, and that's their vote. White, he definitely said it. Black, he definitely did not say it. Gray, maybe he said it. Okay? Typically, they come out saying, with most of these, Jesus didn't say it. Jesus never said, blessed are the poor in spirit. You see, that's the product of the Matthean community wanting to communicate something of concern to them at a later time in history, and they retrofit that statement back into the mouth of Jesus in order to give it weight so that whatever, you know, concern they had could be pushed. And that's just a, you know, kind of a popular expression of how this works. Usually the assumption is that we know virtually nothing about the life of Christ. He's kind of a mystery man back there. But we do know something about the community that describes him, and we can learn some things about that community from these documents. Let's see, a forgery once again. That's not your getting good at this. That is not bad, but you're not fooling me, man. Thank you. Thank you. Okay, that's right. And the smiley face, nice touch. Very nice, yeah, good job. All right. So I heard you did decently on your thesis yesterday. Did you have any bullet holes in you by the time it was over?
I wasn't listening to it, so I have no idea.
Believe me, I know the feeling. How many times have I lectured and had no idea, what am I talking about? I don't know. All right, so I'm going to give you tomorrow about 5 lines to explain what I just spent a half an hour describing here. Too bad, Jacob. You're on your own for that one. It may be one of the good people in this class will actually give you a little help with this, but that's where I'm going to leave it. All right, any other questions about that? I knew we didn't talk about that, so now you can add that to your little treatment of Hegel. I'm sorry, this year, more than any other, has been a little chaotic. You know, we had to kind of keep going back and tucking people in. Now I'm going to jump back to Freud, just to keep you in a state of complete chaos. You know? So.
Wait, so there's nothing on like the life of Hegel or?
No. He lived a deadly boring life. Who cares? You know, I mean, some philosophers live great lives. I mean, Kierkegaard, he had a life his life is his philosophy, so we have to do that. Even with Nietzsche a little bit, you know. Some of these guys, I mean, Kant, oh, who cares, really? Who cares? Hegel, you know, so. All right, return to Freud. The only thing I have left to finish in your notes on Freud are his arguments against the existence of God.
Are we done with Marx?
Yes.
The room with Marx.
Yes, we're done with Marx.
Okay.
Where's Freud?
That's why he used a pencil.
Y'all found the appropriate place in your notes, or you may have to add a little sidebar somewhere to, you know. All right. Freud is an atheist, as are virtually all of the dominant philosophers in the 19th century. So at that point, he's not distinguished in any special way. But he's not only an atheist, he's also a psychologist. And as a psychologist, he is constantly encountering the problem of religion. Every time he starts counseling someone, he finds that the religious element plays in to the problems this person has. They have ideas of God. They have ideas of their religious training. They have ideas of conscience. They have ideas that are all heavily religious in character. And Freud wants to help people with that, but he himself has to begin thinking, how is it, since of course there is no God, that we have all of this religious feeling? You see that? That's the problem. It is kind of odd, isn't it? I mean, if we all just assume, as any smart person would, that there is no God, you know, then why is there this constant, pervasive religious obsession that is always in play? Not only with people who are neurotic, but even with normal people. They keep traipsing off to church every Sunday and praying and doing silly things like that. So Freud is wondering, where did this religion come from? Civilization and its discontents is one of the places where he discusses this. There's others, but that would be a good place to go if you want to do this. I'm not giving you a thorough list. I just want to give you a couple of representative examples of how Freud accounts for the fact that we are so religious, given that there is no God. So these are really not arguments against the existence of God. They are explanations for the presence of religion, assuming that there is no God. Now grab that. And his first hypothetical explanation is the, I'll just call it the killing the father explanation. So he wants you to imagine a primordial tribe in some nondescript jungle in a primitive, unsophisticated setting. People living in grass huts, dirt floors, that kind of thing. Way back in the early days of human development. And of course, yes.
Just so I might have zoned out a little bit. Is this his reason why we have this idea of religion?
Yeah.
Okay.
This is his explanation of where religion came from. And it's a hypothetical explanation. He has many of these. This is just one of the better known ones. All right. So he wants you to imagine this backwards little village. And of course, as commonly happens in little villages or not so little villages, what you find is the youthful population always is smarter than the older population. Young people are always smarter than the older people. You know? When I was in college, I and my whole generation believed that the people who were 30 or 40 years older were idiots. That was the working assumption. That's why we were in Vietnam. That's why all these bad things were happening. And we knew better. And there's this kind of youthful arrogance that we figured it out and all you older folks are stupid. One of the most famous phrases of my generation was, never trust anybody over, do you know how old? 30. Never trust anybody over 30. I heard an advertisement, maybe some of you caught it on TV, where some guy who's my generation, and it's supposed to be a humorous line at the end of the commercial, and he says, and remember, never trust anybody over 90. You see, because all my generation are now 60, and so we're having to bump out the date a little bit. So anyway. But that was a little bit of a joke, but it was also a little bit of serious. Like, anybody over 30 is an idiot. That was the view, and that's been around for a long time. And every young generation has that view, a little bit of youthful arrogance, as it's called. And usually the older folks are patient with it because they know, well, I used to be that way myself. All right, so anyway, Freud describes that. Here's the young bucks. However, they take matters into their own hand, Freud speculates, and says, they decide to kill off the chieftain, the old man, the patriarch of the society, who's been there now for all these years. They're just going to get rid of him. So they do. They kill him. Thinking that is going to catapult them, the younger folks, into this position of leadership, respect. But it has just the opposite effect. As soon as they see his dead body, there's massive problems. There's guilt. They've done a bad thing. They feel it. They feel the loss of his leadership, his wisdom. Now they realize he wasn't as much of an idiot as they thought. As soon as they start having problems come along, they realize they usually go to him for counsel. He's not there anymore. And the rest of the community looks very negatively on what they've done. And so, what do? You have this almost emotional breakdown over this. And so, in a sort of attempt to recreate Father who is now dead, you recreate him totemically. And it gives rise to totemic religion. You've heard of totem poles. Well, this is totemic religion, in which you create images of various descriptions which will stand for the missing father. Usually the missing father projected totemically is angry. So you have a totem pole image, and the conspicuous face, not so happy. Angry dad. And so this angry dad requires appeasement. Some kind of offering, some kind of sacrifice. And the angry father doesn't get a lot happier. He wants more. So there comes to be an ongoing practice of sacrifice, trying to appease the angry father so that he won't punish, which he is now in a position to do. So out of this comes the association of Father with God, you see. What do we pray? We pray, Our Father. Where'd that Father idea come from? It came from an ancient assassination of a father who's now come back as this angry Father God who must be appeased. Freud says also, in the community now that is filled with this grief, somebody rises to the surface. This herd of elephants out there. Somebody rises to the surface who is going to represent the community to try to appease the father. And many times that will be the elder brother. And so the elder son, in a sense, takes on the weight of the wrongdoings of the community in an attempt to appease the wrath of the father, offering himself. And you develop an idea of an older son becoming a sacrifice to appease the father. And he plays with this at much greater length and in much greater subtlety than I am, but of course he eventually gets us to an idea of Jesus dying on the cross to appease the wrath of God, and traces that back to a kind of deep, primordial, primitive religious impulse that, he thinks happened millennia ago. Yeah.
So, does he address then the motivation that they have to, this guilt that they have that causes them to recreate the Father? Because that seems like he's starting with that already.
Yeah, you're right, and he would say the guilt itself is an effect of in other words, I kill the Father, and the first experience I have is the feeling I've just destroyed what has been the source of my greatest security. All of a sudden I see the flip side of what I've done.
Yeah.
And that's a negative feeling. So I feel bad, and that leads to this guilt. So guilt is really sort of the effect of just the remorse I have over I've just shot myself in the foot kind of thing, and now I'm feeling the pain of that. Does that make sense? So it's not guilt immediately, but guilt pretty rapidly comes in related to that. So this, now again, Freud is not saying this absolutely happened this way. He's giving a hypothetical explanation of how religion could have come to exist, and especially how the Christian religion could have come to exist.
Better not be behaving grumpily.
Something. You just know what's going to happen, don't you? Right? Yeah, what are you going to do? And so anyway, over about 10,000, you like that? Yeah, see, she's the one kid who can just yank rank right here. She's good. So over, thousands of years, what you get is a highly sophisticated version of this in the Christian faith, but at its heart, that's what it is. That makes sense, huh? So that's the killing the Father. The other one is simply religion as phobia. I'll try to give this to you more rapidly because time is running out. But the basic idea is that we go back to the primitive culture. People are living in this society, and they are dealing with the raw forces of nature, the hurricane, the tornado, the earthquake, the tsunami, these raw forces of nature that come in, and you can't do anything about it. They're just utterly overwhelming. They put your life at risk, and there's no way to interact with them. How do you negotiate with a hurricane? How do you make a treaty with a tornado? How do you appease a tsunami? The point is, these are impersonal forces over which we have no control. And so he says, what we do is we invent personality and attach it to the impersonal force. Because if I'm dealing with a person, I've got some options. If Kayla comes at me with a gun because she's upset with me over something, not probable, of course, but if it's Kayla, I can plead with her, I can beg, I can cajole, I can bribe, I can anything, please, Kayla, I've got a wife and kids, I can appeal to her sympathy, I can try to bribe her. Hey, Kayla, listen, if you'll just not shoot me, I'll give you an A in philosophy or something, whatever. I can try to, I've got all kinds of options. Do you see, I cannot use those options on an earthquake. I can't go and try to bribe an earthquake. But I can bribe the God of the earthquake. So I personalize. This is classic personification. I personalize the earthquake and then try to bribe, appease, please, somehow, the person that I've associated with that power. And he says you continue that for long enough, and eventually you get the Christian faith. That's all we're doing. We're just kind of personalizing the universe. So we have now the God of nature, the God of creation. So that when bad things happen, we can pray to that God. And this is just a couple of examples. Makes sense, you kind of follow that. That's, his kind of psychological analysis of how there came to be religion. I'm going to bypass the only other little paragraph I was going to give you on him, so that little hole in your notes will just be there, sorry, forever. We got to move on. Other philosophers are waiting.
It's those first fives. We can blame the first fives because we're not getting substance.
Yeah.
That's right.
And
Yeah.
we don't have enough time.
Tomorrow, I'm going to give you the period to get ready for a test on Friday. So, any of you that are feeling, charitable might give Jacob a heads up as to what I talked about. But it looks like Spencer's got something on. Oh, there it is. Okay. No friends in here, man. Yep. See ya.